Hello and welcome to Unwarranted Music Opinions. This is a special edition in which we are talking to Mark Hosler of Negativland. I'm June Lindberg here with Bryan Courtney.
Hello.
And Chaz Jenkins.
Is there any escape from noise?
And Mark Hosler. And no, we still haven't seemed to manage to escape from it yet. No, we have not. And yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. I'm one of the, I guess my title is I'm a co-founder of the group. We're avidly non-hierarchical in how we operate and try to be very kind of Democrat slash anarcho. I don't know what we are. Anarcho-syndicalists, something. I don't know. Anyway, yeah. So co-founder, that would be the best that I would get for my title.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as we were saying before we started or click the record button, it's awesome for you to take the time to talk to just a trio of music nerds who don't really have an audience, really. We're just doing this because it's really interesting to talk to artists and just get their perspective on things. Before I lose it, I had a thought about what you were talking about before we started recording. And that was that you mentioned you grew up on the West Coast and then ended up moving to the Appalachian Mountains and on a dirt road near, an exotic wildlife shelter place with wolves howling. And so that struck me as interesting because when I listen to a Negativland record, there's a lot happening. Like there's so much happening at once.
Yes.
A lot of the time.
We're not minimalists.
No. And a lot of it strikes me as evoking more urban or city imagery in my head.
Yeah.
What led you to deciding to move to the Appalachian Mountains at the end of a dirt road?
Well, the story goes back further. It's that I left the San Francisco Bay Area in 1990, and I grew up in the suburbs east of San Francisco. None of us ever lived in San Francisco when this all started. We were all, Negativland is very much a product of growing up in these kind of bland monoculture, West Coast, Northern California suburbs. That's where we all met. And our records very much when I listen to them, very much reflect that experience. Mm-hmm. But then when I got a little older and I moved out of, living with my mom and dad for a little while, I continued to live in the suburbs with the rest of Negativland. We got a house together, worked on records. But eventually we ended up living in a slightly more urban environment. And as a low income person, I just realized over time, by the time I was in my maybe mid-20s, I realized just for me, I can't speak for the rest of our group, but I was not sort of psychically cut out for being poor and struggling in a city and just that level of intensity and noise and just, the people you're surrounded by who are all living really difficult lives, trying to survive. It just wasn't for me. And took me a while to realize that. And I ended up moving up north when I was 28 years old to Olympia, Washington. So by 1990, I landed in Olympia, Washington, where I was there for 13 years, actually. And for me, I'm really glad I was there because when we went through some of the most difficult periods of our career, when we were sued for the U2 record we made in 91, I think I handled it better because it was an amazing adventure, but it was also really brutal to go because it took up 5 years of our lives, basically literally every day for 5 years, fighting and struggling over that record and the aftermath of it. And so I was living in a place that was kind of a small hippie college town and near lots of trees and the water and my cost of living was really low, so I didn't have to worry about making too much money. So all those things just kind of I seem to thrive better when I live sort of in maybe on the edges of kind of liberal, artsy, kind of lefty little enclaves and stuff. So, however, our audience is very much in the big cities, and I love visiting big cities, and many of my, great friends and kind of peers in the kind of weird Plunderphonics world we exist in, that's where they live. They're all in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and Toronto and London and wherever. So I love seeing all those people when I can. But yeah, for my own sanity, to be able to continue doing this crazy shit that I was doing with my friends, getting out into the country was the thing for me to do.
So looking at your quick bio on your website, you've been sued not once, but twice. What's that experience?
Correct.
What's that experience like to get sued not once but twice? And of the two, which was the better experience?
Well, I would say it was. That's a funny question. It's sort of like having a flesh-eating zombie that just attaches itself to, your shoulder, and it's just sort of eating you, and it's just continuing to eat and munch on you, and and for 5 years it's just attached to you, and you can't get it off of you. I think being sued for the work that we made was really interesting and an incredible kind of opportunity. It gave us a platform in which to speak about larger issues about what are the directions of art and creativity when they collide with new technologies, archaic copyright laws, and the way corporations kind of are taking over the world. That was interesting. When we then were sued again by our own record label that we were on at the time, SST Records, where we got sued for putting out a magazine that was about being sued, then it became stupid and frustrating and painful. And I remember when it happened, I made me cry. I cried. I mean, I remember I was in tears because it was just it was like, oh my God, because the first lawsuit, I felt like we disagreed with what they were doing, but I feel like these are business people protecting their business, their perception of their turf, right? The second lawsuit was by a vengeful guy who just hated our guts and was going to use his wealth that he'd made from selling thousands of Black Flag, records and Husker Du records and Minutemen records, and he was just going to use his money to destroy us. And that's really was his intent, was just to lash out and hurt us. And that was very clear, because we knew him enough. We understood the way he operated enough. I knew him enough. I'm talking about Greg Ginn, who founded both Black Flag and SST Records. So it was, that became pretty ugly, but still, I don't know. We basically learned that we want to keep as far away as we possibly can from being on any record label, no matter how big or small. I know some people who run record labels who are actually decent human beings, but I feel like it's kind of like politicians, lawyers, and car mechanics are all kind of guilty until proven innocent. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They have to prove that they're okay. And there are some ones out there that are okay. There are. But I just think that the business of music is basically inherently about exploiting artists to make money. It's built in, it's kind of baked into the structure. So when you have musicians, who don't know enough about how contracts work and how the business works, and if you're a sort of an unscrupulous person in any way, even a little, you can start to take advantage of that. And it's a slippery slope. I don't think all lawyers, car mechanics, and politicians and record label owners start out as on the dark side. But I think it's a very easy slope to slide down into, and I think that's what happened definitely with SST Records. That's what I think. So, and I've seen it with so many other situations, that it seems like it's almost like a personality type is drawn to doing this. So,
I think we can all relate to the shoulder zombie metaphor. Anyway, just to judge it, the timing wasn't there. I had the joke when you were talking about the zombie, and then the conversation went further, and I was like, I still got to talk. I got to say, yeah, everyone can relate to that with the zombie metaphor. Anyway.
Who's been your zombie that's been attached to you for never letting go?
Bryan.
No, come on. That's not true. That's mean. That's mean-spirited. I would never come at you like that.
Yes, you would.
So,
Just don't put any like taco sauce on your shoulder, Charles, and you'll be.
Yeah.
No one will want to eat you. You'll be fine.
so I got into Escape from Noise. It was like last year.
Yes.
Last year, like later in the year.
And how did it come across your? Because in this day and age, it's so different than back when the record came out. How did it come across your radar?
Basically, I'm just a huge music nerd, and I tend to look online for any and all music that I can find, and naturally I sort of came upon the genre of Plunderphonics. I'd already listened to staples of the genre, but over the last year as well, I've been getting a little bit more into some more avant-garde approaches to that kind of thing, like sound collage and just weirder stuff in general.
Yeah.
And so Escape from Noise was kind of a natural one to go to at a certain point. And at first, when you listen to this album, this is what we talked about on the show when I brought it to the show so that we could all discuss it. This was one of the big takeaways that I had for the record, and I think that over time everyone else came to agree on, is that you listen to it once and you laugh, and then you listen to it 2 or 3 more times, and it's not funny anymore, really. Because it's just a bit like it's surreal and it's weird and it's zany and it's got a sense of humor. But you listen to Yellow, Black, and Rectangular for the 5th or 6th time, and you're not laughing at the end of that song. You're kind of brooding at the end of that song.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. I like that. I mean, I think that our stuff is much of our subject matter is very dark. We're looking at stuff that's in our country, our culture, technology. We're looking at absolutely, religion, et cetera. We're looking at the dark side of all these things with our own screwy, skewed way that, as you say, could be quote unquote, have some zany things in it. But we're trying to look at the dark part of it in the work. We're always doing that. We're not trying to distract you from that. Right. But we're taking our own sort of strange approach. Negativland's work, to whatever degree it's funny, it's not funny because we sit around thinking it needs to be funny. It's not contrived. It's just that we all like things that are funny. Everyone in the group, in the larger collective, all like things that are funny. And so for the most part, with some exceptions, but for the most part, when we're working on an album, a live show, and any new project, if anyone comes up with something to add to it that's funny, it goes in. Like we want it in there. And perhaps it's partly just as a human being, part of how I keep my sanity in the face of how dark things can seem in the world, is to be able to also, keep my sense of humor. So I think everyone in Negativland's like that, and it leaks into the records very strongly. Now, also, I think it means that as heady and conceptual and kind of brainy as our work is, I think that gives people a way in. I think that's one reason why Escape from Noise did so well. I mean, to our shock and so almost horror, it was kind of a college radio hit when it came out. It was in heavy rotation on stations all over the country, like really heavy rotation for like 6 months. It was really bonkers. But I felt like we'd kind of accidentally come up with this sort of formula that was excessively weird. Mm-hmm. And instead of us being played on the 1 a.m. experimental music show on a college radio station, we were being played in the middle of the day between, I don't know who was, Pixies and REM, and stuff like that. And just by much more normal types of DJs, we're using our record to kind of just spice up their set a little bit. So that was a really lovely surprise when that happened.
So, the thing that stuck out to me about the record most, and this is why I love Plunderphonics in general, is just the amount of samples used to create this entire new project. You can go into this any way you want. It's a pretty broad question. What was the recording process like? How did you determine, okay, we're going to use this sample for this sample for that? And, are there any interesting stories of coming across some of the samples that ended up on the project?
Well, let's see. The record took 4 years to make. The first 3 albums we made were all done with 4-track tape recorders, and we then pooled our money. We all moved into a new place together, a different place. This was the place that ultimately caught on fire just before Escape from Noise came out, which you may or may not know that I saved the master tapes and the artwork from a building while on fire. I mean, I was running in and out of the building, having to decide, and it's where I lived, so I was having to decide what to save. And I thought, okay, I can just forget about everything that belongs to me or to Don, or Chris, and I'm going to run out and I got to save what we've been working on for the last 4 years. Then maybe I can save some of the recording studio, like grab the mixer, grab the tape decks, grab the synthesizer, the guitar, etc. But the first thing I did, and I just set them on the street in front of the building. And luckily nobody walked off with them. But it was the pencil drawing on the front cover, which is based on a Polaroid photograph of my great uncle. It was taken in 1968 in front of the Golden Gate Bridge. And then we had the idea to alter it, but we just reimagined it as a little color pencil drawing that Don did. And so all that was saved from that building. We had an 8-track tape recorder we got a hold of, which gave us 4 more tracks, so that was amazing. We doubled the amount of tracks we had. So for us, that was like opening up huge new possibilities. We'd been exploring on the previous album, A Big 10/8 Place, we'd really explored in depth using tape splicing as a compositional tool. We'd done tape splicing on the first 2 records, but really we kind of realized, wait a minute, you could use cutting the tape as a way to actually just compose the music, not just make tape loops and kind of structure things in a general way, but really microscopically compose the record. And if you listen to A Big 10/8 Place and Escape from Noise and realize that was Escape from Noise is the very next one we made, it's an interesting leap. But because we'd kind of explored this arrhythmical, noisy soundscape approach to manipulating found sound, we then thought, what if we could take the skills we're developing and apply it to kind of a more pop music form? Could we do that? Would that work? And that was a new challenge, because we spent 3 years making a Big 10/8 Place. So we kind of felt like we're over that. Like, we've done that, we've explored that. Let's take this somewhere new. And we were making tape loops. Like, can we make a tape loop that's actually in 4/4 time? Can we use a 4-track tape loop? So each track of the tape loop is a different sound, but because it's a loop, they're all in sync, and we can turn the different tracks on and off to make a piece. And nowadays you can do all this in a split second using any kind of multi-track digital audio workstation. But back then, this was very, very challenging for us to pull off and pull it together. So that was kind of from a kind of an aesthetic standpoint, and then from a conceptual standpoint, Big 10/8 Place is our first concept album, and it's where we really started to realize. And again, at this point, wait a minute, how old was I when we started making A Big 10/8 Place? I was 21. So we started realizing that tape collage and appropriation was actually a really interesting way to talk about the world we live in, right? It wasn't just something to use to be funny or weird or random. It's that you could really drill down into the tapes you were using and how you assembled them together, and you could really start to use it to talk about specific things. The first baby steps we took was with A Big 10/8 Place, which came out in 1983, and then the next big leap for us was Escape from Noise. And because we were making noise and sound and all that, we kind of decided that noise itself came kind of the subject matter for it.
So I wanted to, me personally, some of the samples that stuck out to me the most, I wanted to get your...
Yeah, and there's stories on all kinds of...
Yeah, I wanted to get some of your stories on some of these specific samples.
And one thing I should say, though, to kind of, in a general way, answer one of your other questions, is that we get inspired by what we find. So I think a big part of how our work develops is pretty organic. It's not, oh my God, we want to make a piece about blah, 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 blah. Let's find something that fits that. I think that would have a contrived, stiff feeling to it. But it's because we run across something. And I mean, on Escape from Noise, the most famous example is the Christianity is Stupid track. Mm-hmm. And it's Richard found this record album in a thrift store by the Reverend Estes W. Perkle that's called "If Footmen Tire You, What Will Horses Do?" And he brings it to the group and he says, listen, there's this guy, on the record, he's a Christian preacher saying Christianity is stupid, give up, give up, give up. Communism is good. And he's not only, is it a Christian preacher saying it, but he's really musical. I mean, listen to him. He sounds like he's almost singing. And so we just thought, what if and again, this is felt to us like a very new idea when we were working on this in like 84, 85, 86. What if you could take found voice elements and make them the vocalist of a song?
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? We want to try that.
Right.
And at that point, it felt to us fairly innovative new approach to how to make a piece of music.
So some of the songs that I wanted to mention, and you could just talk about how you came across the samples and what made you want to use them the way you did.
Yeah.
The Playboy Channel, Over the Hiccups, Car Bomb,
Sure.
Yellow, Black, and Rectangular, and You Don't Even Live Here.
Sure. Well, there's stories with all of those. So start with your list. What was the first one?
I would be most fascinated. I'm going to chime in because that's kind of one of my questions. I wanted to, in particular, the Yellow, Black, and Rectangular and the You Don't Even Live Here. I was most curious about those because that part of the album to me has always been laser focused. I feel like when you know what I mean? Like that part really lasers in on, in a general way, radioactivity, right, and power plants. My understanding of the history around that is not good. I don't really know. So I was always curious, like, what made you all kind of go in that direction? Like, what in particular drove you to tackle those topics in a more detailed way?
Well, again, it's stuff that we found that inspired the tracks. But Yellow, Black, and Rectangular, what that piece is really dealing with is it's something that you didn't grow up with. If you were a kid growing up, in the 60s and the 70s, the threat of global nuclear annihilation was very, very present in your mind and out there in the world. It just was this dark cloud that hung over you as a kid. And so that piece is about that type of fear and paranoia around that. It is a public service announcement that Don found on a record album that was somewhat comedic, and he transferred it to a reel-to-reel. And pardon me, I have to burp. I'm drinking bubble water while we're talking, so burps are gonna.
Not Nesbitt's lime soda. Dang.
It is lime.
Okay.
It is a lime fizzy drink. So I think I'm on brand here, I think.
Very good. Very good.
Yes. I will tell you a top secret thing is that Nesbitt's lime soda doesn't actually exist. There is a Nesbitt's orange soda.
Okay.
And that's inspired this track, but we thought it would be funnier to make up a drink that was sort of real but wasn't real at all. So that's just the kind of thing we would think to do. So what was I saying? So that was Don transferred that record album of the psychiatrist and the patient talking to each other to a reel-to-reel recording tape. And he transferred it multiple times, so he had many versions of them saying the same things. And then he took a razor blade, because this is all pre-digital world, right, folks listening at home. And this is all early '80s that he's doing this. And he just repeated the phrases and interspersed them with each other, and gradually worked out this long, extended conversation that never has actually happened. And that existed as what we in Negativland would call a razor tape. And Time Zones is also a razor tape. Discernment on the True False album from a couple years ago, that's a razor tape. Piece of Pie from No Business is what we would. Yeah, that's just a term. That's just like an inside Negativland term we use to refer to it with each other. It's a razor tape. Then the music is that Chris had a Commodore 64, and we borrowed a couple of Yamaha DX7 synthesizers, which were at the time extremely new and cutting edge and very expensive. We couldn't afford them, but we borrowed a few, and we were using something called MIDI, which was at the time very new, and we used the Commodore 64 to control the two DX7 synthesizers to play that pattern, musical pattern you hear in the background. And then we realized that the voice tapes went with the music in an interesting way. So they all kind of, the music developed as it on its own, the voice tape developed on its own, and then we realized late at some point further down the road, oh, why don't we blend these two together? Let's see how that sounds. Oh, that's good. I think this is a track. That's a pretty good example of how a track would organically just kind of, develop. The track You Don't Even Live Here, that is a recording of a woman at a public hearing to do with I think it's the Diablo Canyon nuclear reactor in California that is obviously scaring the shit out of people in the community. And she is outraged and just barely controlling her rage and giving this incredibly intense testimony at this public hearing. And we ended up with this recording that, as you hear it, it's kind of distorted. Mm-hmm. And later on, we found a version of it that was a perfectly clean recording of it. And we realized that we really liked the distorted version so much better. It had this real energy to it. And it just, I think when we heard that tape, it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I mean, It still does. I think it's just incredibly powerful. It almost feels like I feel emotion and tears welling up in my eyes and the hair standing up in the back of my neck. And I mean, that woman is not messing around. And so there was something about that we just thought was very powerful. We had that just in our library, of stuff. And then the music for it is one of those 4-track tape loops that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And the rhythm, let's see if I can remember it. We had this, there was an early kind of comedy dance record by Eddie Murphy called Boogie in Your Butt. You know it or not?
No, but
I know he had a music career. I've heard his big one-hit wonder.
Well, he did Party All the Time.
Yeah.
Which I was really disappointed by, because what Boogie in Your Butt, what's so great about it is that it is a dance piece about dance music. I mean, it's actually about the stupidity of dance lyrics and the whole genre. I mean, it is a good dance floor track, and it's also about what it is. So of course, we love stuff like that. It's very meta, and I was really disappointed when he did Party All the Time, which is a perfectly fine, dumb 80s pop song, but I just thought, there's no layers to this. It's just a normal dance track about partying all the time. So we took, we had it on vinyl, and we had an early digital delay called an effectron, which could hold up to 1 second of sound. It could either be a delay or like an echo delay, or you could grab it, you could press a button, and you could loop the sound for a second. So that rhythm that kind of goes, that rhythm is a grab in the effectron from Boogie in Your Butt, slowed down, put onto one channel of a 4-track tape loop that was being played on a TX 4-track. Then I think the guitar part, that's little harmonics, is being played at half speed. And of course, none of us are that good of guitarists, but it's being played at half speed, kind of just improvised. And we just recorded a bunch of it and pulled a little bit out where we thought, oh, that little improvised bit sounds really cool for those 4 bars. The synthesizer sound, which is probably an ARP Odyssey, but that also, they're just improvised to tape. And then because you select a loop out of it, it plays over and over, and it sounds like kind of a groove. And we thought this had a really weird kind of strange groove to it. And we were playing with that just as music. And then we thought, wait, let's try this woman from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission hearing on top. And of course we said, this sounds awesome.
It's finished.
So we made the track. Yeah.
So one of the artists we've interviewed previously was Tom Ski Mask of the Memphis rap group NOD. And one of the things we mentioned in that interview that was really fascinating to hear was their experience recording back in the 90s on tape and such, and then moving to a digital, and he professed very wonderfully just how much easier it is. For you personally, with your type of music of Plunderphonics and tape and that kind of stuff, how has, the digital era improved, or are you still using the old methods that you were doing back in the 80s, or have you really taken advantage of some of the newer technology that's come out with making the newest music you've released? You know, how has that process changed?
Well, so for the last two albums we made, which is True False in 2019 and the one that came out in late 2020 is called The World Will Decide, those records have a density to them and a complexity to them that is only because we are working with Pro Tools. And John in the group is unbelievably skilled at doing it in a way that I am not. But he is just incredible at, and it allows you to do microscopic things with the timing of things. You can even go, take a sentence and actually put a quarter of a second or pause in between a word in a sentence, which can make it line up so it feels more musically. It has a cadence to it that is more musical, the way it fits on the rhythm of a track. So it allows a level of microscopic, kind of deconstruction of our found sounds and layering into the music that's quite extraordinary. But I would say that unlike a lot of bands, our stuff is composed using the tools we have. Like the recording studio is the tool, right? It is the instrument. So it's sort of like that track I mentioned, that You Don't Even Live Here. That's a whole thing from playing with 4-track tape loops and like experimenting with razor blades and what can we do, and out of it, and experimenting with speeding up a guitar double speed and using a loop of a found record stuck in there. And so basically the music of that track entirely emerges from experimenting with the recording studio, as opposed to the person you interviewed. Maybe they're more like a band where they wrote the songs, they played them as a band in a room, and they go into the studio to record them. And the studio still has an impact on how the records are recorded, and maybe they can do overdubs and embellish them. But there's something where the basic music is coming from writing it in a more old-fashioned way, and Negativland mostly doesn't do that. So I can see that. I appreciate what we can do with the new digital technology, but I also can appreciate that the limitations we had, starting with the first record we ever made, where we had a 4-track with no sound sync, so there wasn't even a way to sync the tracks up with each other. Those limitations forced us into solutions that are why the records sound the way they do. One of the reasons a Big 10-8 Place has literally thousands of tape splices is because it was a way to make the sound busier and more active, even though we only had 4 tracks. Because, well, if you just cut the sound up every second or half second or 3 seconds, you can make it sound like a lot's going on. Whereas actually at any given moment, maybe there's not so much going on, but it creates an illusion to the brain that there's a lot going on. So I know that's kind of answers your question, I hope.
No, yeah, totally.
So something that I wanted to ask on a similar note is, when your stuff in the 80s came out and Plunderphonics was being coined as a term, and
which was a little later. A little later,
yeah.
Yeah, it was a little later. And that's John Oswald in Toronto, who is the person who coined the term Plunderphonics, who eventually became a friend of ours, and he was a wonderful composer. Yeah.
So there's that era whenever the idea of taking samples and creating something completely new out of them, or recontextualizing them in some major way. How do you keep your work fresh? How do you keep your brain just like on it when the ways in which that style of music are constructed have drastically changed and become quite a bit simpler overall? And in a world where at any given time, you can probably jump on Bandcamp and find a Plunderphonics record. What has artistically moved you forward in the past decade or so, when Plunderphonics as an art form is just fairly well known among music nerds?
Well, I would say, kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that we realized that you could do sound collage not just for kind of an effect or for a cute little, was it I always mix it up. Was it the Orb or Orbital? I think it was the Orb who had little fluffy clouds.
I can't remember.
Little fluffy clouds, which I believe is Ricky Lee Jones talking about growing up somewhere in America where there would be these great huge vistas, and she would see all these little fluffy clouds. It's a lovely track, and I like her voice, the way it's used in there. It's not about very much of anything, and which is fine. But for Negativland, the interest was there were two things going on. One, we were very drawn to wanting to try things in music and sound that we weren't hearing being done, because it felt to us that it was transgressive. So there was something about the transgressive nature of stealing things, appropriating things that are not yours, and use them in a context they were never intended to be used in. That was just that concept alone, no matter what you're taking, that was very exciting to us throughout the 80s and into the 90s. However, we also realized the more we kept doing this, because we never had a long-term plan. We were excited to have made one record album, let alone imagining that 41 years later we'd still be doing this shit. So, but we realized that collage was this really interesting way to talk about things in a rather complex way, and as I've said before in a lot of interviews, paradoxically a more honest way. There was something that felt more true and honest about talking about the insane, weird culture we live in America by using the culture itself to talk about it, as opposed to writing song lyrics about it. We do some songs, we do some song lyrics, but not that often. And so I think that we realized that once we ended up with something called samplers and the idea of sampling. Now, the term sampling didn't even exist when we were making Escape from Noise, right? And sampling initially referred to just the taking things and putting it in a particular digital sound recording device called a sampler. So we weren't really doing much in the way of sampling because we couldn't afford samplers. Even when they were new, they were very expensive. So we were still doing most things with the razor blade. But over time, as it often happens, the term just kind of morphed into just generally meaning taking sounds and using them in some new way, And so you see that happen with all kinds of musical terms, like the term ambient or industrial. If you learn what those terms were when they first started, they don't have much to do with what they evolved into.
Right.
Mashups is another term like that had a very specific meaning when it started, but it just ultimately turned into meaning sound collage. And whereas mashups originally really meant taking two songs and layering them on top of each other in an interesting way to create the sense of a third song. So for us, we realized somewhere in the 90s that, these things we're doing that feel transgressive to us, zoom ahead, 10 years from now or 20, it's going to become more and more normal to do this, and once YouTube hits and now we have TikTok, where there's just a bazillion 12 to 13-year-old kids are appropriating mass media every day, repurposing it and making their own weird, goofy thing out of it. That's like a completely cutting edge, avant-garde thing that's now normal, teenage behavior. And so we understand that. And we understand that what we're doing, it isn't transgressive anymore in any way at all, but we're still interested in ideas and using it as a way to talk about stuff. And for some reason, it has remained, to my surprise, it has remained interesting enough to the members of Negativland that we have kept doing it. And so our new records are, in fact, not using appropriated music. They're not using any sampled music because we kind of feel like that's so thoroughly explored that we don't want to go down that route anymore, and that our last two records are completely original music that we wrote ourselves, and played ourselves. And that goes back, a lot of Escape from Noise music is also stuff we wrote and played ourselves too. We've always kind of been a mix, but lately, so we're still looking at appropriation and collage as ways to talk about complex ideas with I think a lot of nuance. I think if you listen again to our last couple records, we worked on them for many, many years. Whether you have the time or inclination or not, they're designed to reveal themselves the more you listen to them. And in fact, those two double albums actually interconnect with each other very densely. And if you give them enough listens, there's all kinds of ways they speak to each other. And I think in this day and age, it's asking a lot of people to spend time carefully listening to music and not just having it on in the background to set a mood. But that's still what we're doing.
Well, that's all we do on the show is listening to music intently. We do it so nobody else has to.
That's right. Well, that's how I listened to records when I was a kid. You know, if I got a record album, I would lay down on my parents' orange shag carpet in front of the giant Magnavox console stereo and put on a pair of really huge boxy headphones.
Yeah.
And I would just stare at the record cover and the liner notes in their sleeve, if there was one, and just listen to that record over and over and over again. You know, so I kind of feel like that's sort of it's such a formative experience for me that's still what we're drawn to doing. Like, we're making records for that kind of imaginary person who maybe there's almost nobody out there who listens that way anymore. I don't know, but that's what we're looking for.
There are people. I keep a record collection. I listen that way. Do you have a record collection yourself? Do you still hold on to any vinyl, or are you kind of out of the game?
Oh no, I have every record I've bought since I was 10 years old. I have everything. Well, it takes up so much space and it's so heavy that I have been thinking, and also I'm getting older and thinking, at some point I do need to let go of it. And I have been actually thinking, I can announce it here now that I actually am thinking I do want to just sell the whole thing. It'd be really cool to find someone who wanted to buy it all as a collection of, here's all the records that formed my musical brain. Well, and maybe someone out there would want to buy it. I think I have about 1,400 records, maybe something like that.
Well, not to bonk Bryan again, but every paycheck he scours Discog and drops about $100 on a vinyl. So hit him up. He'll probably.
We could. We're gonna have a little more space soon. We'll look at, if you want to keep in touch with me. I'll.
I have this special shelving in my living room. It's made of old floor joists that are 2 inches thick. And then I have these cement, these big cement blocks. They're kind of they have some character to them. They're not cinder blocks, but they're these kind of rough hewn cement slab things that hold them up. And I have like 3 tiers of shelves to put all my albums out. And it was the ultimate. I wanted to get wood where it would never ever sag, right? And these are floor joists from a building in Asheville that was being demolished. So they're very old. They're like old growth wood. And that's what I hold up my records. And I have them divided up into categories. And of course, because Negativland did all these, we had our weekly radio show, I have my selection of religious records, children's records, sound effects records, organ music records, 70s pop hits. I have a fake Italian section, a fake French section, movie soundtrack section, et cetera, et cetera.
What is fake French? What is fake Italian?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question. There's this whole sort of genre in the 50s and 60s of these records geared toward tourists, where maybe you might buy it when you visited the country to kind of take home as a souvenir from visiting France or Italy. There's that. And then there's also records that I think were geared to people who were never going to go there, but just wanted to feel like they were there. So there's all of these. I love them. I mean, I genuinely love this music. And it's all this kind of, for want of a better term, this kind of schlocky, pseudo-Italian, pseudo-French music. And all these records, it's all from kind of the late 50s into the mid 60s. And I have enough of them that I have enough for them to each have their own category in my record collection. But yeah, I really enjoy it a lot. I enjoy that stuff a lot.
So, Mark, I just thought of this and I wanted to get your opinion on it because you've already kind of touched on a few genres of music. There are 2 genres of music that I really enjoy. Well, one of them I really enjoy, the other I just find fascinating, that I think were spawned from the idea of plunderphonics and sampling things. And I wanted your opinion on them. If you know what they are. If you don't, then this is a busted question, but maybe I'll get lucky. Have you ever heard of lowercase music? For listeners at home who cannot see what I'm doing in our Skype call, I'm holding my hands up, giving a dumbfounded, I don't know expression. I've never heard of that. Tell me what it is. Lowercase music is the idea of sampling very, very quiet, typically nature sounds. Like the most popular artist in the genre is Steve Roden, who has a 56+ minute album called Forms of Paper, where he literally records himself turning pages of paper, and it's like this garbled digital, like super ambient thing. I just wanted
nice. Lowercase music?
Yep, lowercase.
That name. I'll tell you, I do have an absolute aversion to just being labeled to any, the idea of this this weird compulsion to just label genres and subgenres and subgenres is just, it sort of drives me crazy.
The other one is probably a little bit more popular that you might have heard of that I really enjoy, and we've talked about on the show, Vaporwave. Have you ever heard of this genre?
Yes, and in fact, David Wills in Negativland, the weather, also known as the Weatherman, he definitely enjoys that stuff, the Vaporwave stuff. And I think from what I've heard of it, it's okay. It's taking some music from in a shopping mall and slowing it down a little bit and putting a shit ton of reverb on. There's not that much going on. It sets a kind of a vibe, and I can appreciate that for sure. And I play music in the background a lot myself. I listen to instrumental music a lot myself. But as a sound appropriator, it's very hard for me to take that hat off and just it's hard to listen to it and not kind of think, geez, I wish they were doing more with this. You know, I wish there was more going on here than just taking someone else's track and just tweaking it subtly and then saying that's a new thing, which is fine, you know, and it's funny to me and interesting that it's become a whole genre. But yes, I'll tell you, I particularly enjoy music that has nothing to do with what I create, because that part of my brain that just can't stop itself from kind of picking it apart at a kind of like a recording level, you know, analysis and how they were using the tools and the tricks in the studio, you know, whereas if I listen to some old Lightning Hopkins records on the Aladdin label, you know, from the 50s or 60s, my brain doesn't do that, you know, so I just kind of take it in. Or I listen to music from other countries, you know, traditional music from other countries in languages I don't understand. And that's also enjoyable to me because my brain just can't pick at it, you know.
Would you mind if I threw you a vaporwave recommendation that I think does a lot? Try listening to the album I'll Try Living Like This by Death's Dynamic Shroud. That's one to me that does a shocking amount. And is a very, what's the word? I always forget.
It's a bit busier, isn't it? It's been a while since I've listened to it. It's busy,
but it's also
complex.
Oh my god. No, it is
layered, nuanced.
Layered. It is
music. Is it music?
It is music. That's what I was thinking of.
Is it black, rectangular, yellow? What are we trying to get here?
What is it? Well, you know, I should say that I sometimes hear people, and I've also, you know, been to some experimental music performances with someone who's just sort of starting out, and I part of my brain kind of wants, it just kind of can't help itself from ripping it all to shreds, but another part of my brain thinks, well, I hope they keep doing this and they keep exploring keep going where it seems to be taking them, because like when I first heard Vaporwave, and I haven't kept up. So I would say that when I first heard Vaporwave, my other thought was, I hope some of these people keep doing this, but keep tweaking it and maybe get tired of the how simple their initial stuff is and start to do things that are more dense and are more complex, and that it evolves and grows. You know,
ambitious. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, ambitious.
It's ambitious, and I do think there's a decent amount of vaporwave out there that is surprisingly ambitious. Well, and it's like you said, where it starts with a simple concept.
Yeah.
And then over the course of a decade.
Yeah.
At this point, people have like taking it to some of its logical extremes of ambition.
One of the other couple songs from the record that I wanted to get some insight on, Over the Hiccups. What's the story behind that song?
Well, I was a preschool teacher, and I would take my tape recorder to school and record the kids when I was on the job. And there was a little girl. Her name was Louisa Michaels. Her mother was a poet. She's still an active poet, and I think her father at the time wrote screenplays, I think. But her mother, whose name I believe is Brenda Michaels. At some point in the last few years, I actually looked them up, and because they're still out there. But 5-year-old Louisa wanted to sing Over the Rainbow, and I got my tape recorder out, and she had a real serious case of the hiccups, and she was determined, bound and determined, to finish that song no matter what. And that is a almost unedited recording. The only thing we took out is that there is a moment when she stopped and seemed like she was maybe losing her confidence, and I just said, "Come on, Louise, come on, keep going. Oh, keep going, keep going."
Oh, I would have kept that in. You should have, because then that, not to critique your work, but that's not one of my personal favorite moments of the album because it's so patience testing. If you would have kept that part in, I would have been like, you know what? Yeah, come on, girl, you could do it. But as it is, I'm
no,
like,
she got there in the end. She got there.
She got there. Yeah. So and I'll tell you another interesting story to me, at least, about that track is that, and I have these old notebooks that show me all the ways we were trying to sequence the record. And the key to why I think Escape from Noise works the way it does is it's the sequence of the tracks. And once the recording was done, we spent 6 months trying out different ways to sequence it. And back then, this was really painful because you had to take each track and unsplice it and splice them back together. You had to literally physically rearrange them with the reel-to-reels, to play them in the different orders you wanted to try. And so there was all these different orders of how to do the album, and it just wasn't clicking. It wasn't clicking, and it just seemed like there was a part of the record that needed a breath. It needed something. And, we were having kind of band meetings, going about the album sequencing. And at some point, I remembered the recording of the little girl singing Over the Rainbow with the hiccups. And I just had this kind of intuitive, just weird aha. I remember running to Dawn's room, knocking on the door and just saying, "Dawn, I think," I said, "I can't explain why I think this will work, but I think we should put Over the Hiccups on the record and put it right, here between, wherever, I can't remember where it goes, between these two tracks." And Dawn, who generally would argue with me about every single idea I ever had, it was one of those rare times when he just said, "Oh, yeah, that'll work." So you always do with Dawn, and Dawn, who of course, as you may or may not know, is now deceased, but Dawn, who I love dearly and respect dearly, when Dawn did that, you usually felt like, it is a good idea because he didn't argue with me.
I relate so much to this story. These two schmucks are always like, "Chaz, that's a stupid idea. We're not doing that." I'm like,
yeah. But he only ever, Don was a difficult person to collaborate with, but it was always because he was just trying to make the art be the best it possibly could. And I knew that. It was never personal. It was just, I'm just trying to make the record the best we possibly can. And I wouldn't argue and debate with you if I didn't ultimately respect you, which at some point was something he, shared with me after 25 years of being at loggerheads. But so we added that, and it was, for some reason, the sequence just instantly clicked, and we were like, "Oh my God, it works," and so that's a track where, just a little tiny edit, and that's all it was. And I'll tell you one other cute story about that track, because there are kids recorded on our previous album, Big Ten A Place. There's a track called Clowns and Ballerinas that has a little girl improvising lyrics while I'm playing the piano. And I recorded that on the job too. But at the time I was so nervous about letting anyone know what we were doing that I never told her parents about it. It's just something that I just did on the job, recorded it, and then sometime, a few years later, we used it on a record. And with the case of the little girl singing Over the Rainbow with the hiccups, her parents were artsy enough that I felt comfortable saying, "Hey, besides being a preschool teacher, I also do this. This is this other thing I do. I'm in this really weird, sound collage group, and I have this, and I'd like to use this recording of Louisa singing, Over the Rainbow." And they said, "Sure." Years later, I ran into them. It's like 6 years later, and they told me that it made such an impression on their daughter that she was on a record album, because I, gave them a copy when it came out, that they said it inspired her to start her own band. And by the time she was like 11 years old, she had started this little goth band.
Nice.
Like at
Excellent.
10 or 11. And they said, yeah, we think that she gained this kind of confidence because there was a record with her, her voice on it and her name on it, So, of course, I was very, very thrilled to hear this.
I don't know if you know this, but fun fact a little bit about that song. It was sampled by one of my personal favorite bands and a band we really love to discuss on the show, Chumbawamba. But I don't know if I don't know what because I never knew the sample. But I don't know if you knew, did they come to you guys asking for permission to use that sample or?
No, they did not. But they ended up doing a cover version of the U2 song that we did the sound collage version of, and they actually dedicated it to Negativland.
Nice.
And ultimately, they made an album called What You See Is What You Get, which uses a whole bunch of samples from our Helter Stupid album mixed in with their record. We sampled from them talking. It was a radio interview where they were talking about being threatened over their own use of samples, and we sampled from that and used that on the book that we put out called Fair Use, the story of the letter U in the numeral 2, which is about the lawsuit against us over the U2 single, and it's what came out after that magazine I mentioned where we got sued for putting out a magazine that was about being sued for putting out a record, and then a number of years later we put out a book which included the magazine and then everything that came after it. When because of the second lawsuit that you were asking about. So yes, we ended up basically being mutual admirers of Chumbawamba. I keep thinking it's pronounced Chumbawamba. Chumbawamba.
It's Chumbawamba. There's a W there. It's Chumbawamba.
But it is W-A-M-B. So is it Wamba, Wamba?
Yeah, I think it is Wamba. I ended up seeing them perform in Seattle. And the drummer was wearing a Negativland copyright infringement is your best entertainment value T-shirt on stage. And I remember that they came out, and at that point they'd had their big hit. So most of their audience was just people who liked them because of their hit and didn't maybe know enough about all of their politics and their history as an anarchist collective. But I do remember that they came up to the mic and they knew I was there. And they said, this next song is a song by a group called Negativland. And then they started singing Over the Rainbow. and he just sang like a line or two and he hiccuped and then they just went into the next song. That was it. So that was a lot of fun. So
that's awesome.
Yes. So there's a bunch of connections there and they're very interesting and they there's a lot more to be said about that.
Well,
their whole journey of where they went on their career is
bringing them to the show. We've talked about that a bit. I think they're a really cool band. I've never heard of two bands like kind of having this mutual sample friendship going on. Like we'll sample you can sample us, and so on and so forth. I've never.
Well, the great thing about what the album "What You See Is What You Get" is that in the credits it basically said something like, we nicked some things from Negativland. Like they knew that they didn't need to ask, but they still acknowledged that they'd done it. And that's kind of what we ended up, in fact, going back to, you mentioned Plunderphonics, John Oswald, who came up with the phrase and was a real pioneer in that style of music. He was the one who suggested the idea that though you don't ask permission, that you do create what he would call footnotes, like you do list who you've appropriated from. It just seemed like the conceptually and ethically right thing to do, and we agreed with him, very much so. And so the first project we did where we did list everything we'd sampled from was that Fair Use, the story of the letter U in the numeral 2 book, which came out in 95, and it came out with a CD that was an audio collage about audio collage called Dead Dog Records, and that's the first project. In the back of that book, we do list everyone that we could figure out that we sampled from. And of course, we also end up with samples where we don't know who they are. That happens all the time. But we did list it. Yeah.
I don't have anything else. I don't have any other questions, actually. I feel like that was... I'm out. I'm tapped out.
You asked one question, Bryan. You do this every time.
He's listening intently. I can tell.
There's 3 of us. Email me about that vinyl collection. And other than that,
you can't afford it, dumbass.
You don't know that.
Well, Mark, I always like to end interviews with a silly question. Something humorous. My question to you is, will you please sample one of our episodes in an album.
Yeah, it does make it not as fun as if you
just surprise me, pick a little snippet. I'll never know, and just sneak it in there.
All right. There actually is a website. I think it's called Who Sampled.
Yeah,
is it called Who Sampled Who or WhoSampled.com? And people out there have figured out some of the things we've sampled from, but also what's really interesting is that over the years we've been sampled a bunch on some records that sold. I mean, we were sampled on a record by Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, also known as Mark Wahlberg.
Yep.
And it was a record that sold 1 million copies, and he sampled from Escape from Noise. And Escape from Noise has been sampled by a number of different artists. Nina Hagen sampled from us, and who else? I'm forgetting. Oh, darn it! It's some huge female pop star of the last 10 years sampled from us too. But yeah, there's a lot of strange, surprising things that have UB40 sampled from it. Yeah, there's all kinds of things that have surprised me over the years. Fatboy Slim sampled from us.
Yeah.
A guy called Gerald sampled from us. Holger Hiller. Yeah, there's been all kinds of people. So, and obviously we think it's just fine. So, and whether we like what they did with it or not, I mean, it's our approval is not necessary. Mark Wahlberg sample from us is on a record that is just a shockingly dumb record album, and not in a funny way. It's not funny dumb. It's just dumb. But it's I think it's fantastic that we're on something that I know, Don was at home tape recording the MTV Music Video Awards to use it on some project of ours, and they ended up sampling. He was recording when they played a Negativland sample in the MTV Music Video Awards. So goofy. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes. Well, thanks. Those were lots of those were some great questions, and those are a lot of stories I've never told. So that's great. Yeah. Nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for telling them.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're very welcome. All right.
We appreciate it a lot.
Well, signing off. Yeah, and also I guess let me know when the whole thing's gonna run. And I should mention too that we're doing a few live stream performances. We have one that's on a pretty high profile place on that you'll probably know about when it comes out. It's surprising that we are ending up there. And then we do have touring. We've booked a tour for this September, but I don't know whether it'll be safe enough to go out there.
Fingers crossed.
We certainly hope to eventually get back out there in late 2021 and certainly in 2022 and start to perform again. That's the plan. Yeah, thanks. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Take
you
it easy.
very much.
Stay safe.
I'm going to go drink lime soda.
Yeah.